But let me move to Tendayi, because I think we've been touching on the question of statelessness on and off. We've talked about children who are born in countries of destination, who are not necessarily registered. We've talked about people who, you know, don't have access to all sorts of birth registrations and all of this. And obviously the notion of statelessness is something that is much bigger than just in the realm of migration, but in migration in particular, it's very pertinent. Tendayi, we've heard a lot about, you know, the situations of children as well, born in countries of destination. But can you make the linkages between those two issues, between the issue of statelessness and the issue of documentation in the context of migration?
Yeah, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes.
Perfect. So first, I just wanted to say it's an honor to join such a huge group of people doing such important work, both on the panel and not on the panel. And I want to make sure there's time for discussion, so I'll keep it short. I want to do a little bit of definitional discussion and then mention 4 key challenges, I think, that face us in considering the GCM in this context. So first of all, when I say stateless, what do I mean? Well, Pia kind of alluded to the problem that it's a lot more complex than just the legal definition. But as I know, we've got a mixed group. In case it's helpful, the legal definitions comes from the 1954 Statelessness Convention, which refers to a stateless person as someone who is not treated as a national by any state under the operation of its law. And based on that definition alone, we know that there are either 10 million, according to UNHCR, or 15 million, according to ISI, people who meet that definition in the world, probably more. That's quite a conservative estimate. But in fact, as it has been mentioned by lots of people, the challenges associated with statelessness affect a lot more people than just those who meet that definition. And one other challenge in using this terminology, lots of statelessness activists have been asking people to try to think about how they use the word stateless and to be careful about whether in using that terminology there's a risk of reinforcing states' activities, saying that these people are not citizens. Some people say, no, I'm a citizen. And by using the word stateless, you're almost taking the state side in saying that I'm not. So people say I'm a citizen, but the state's not recognizing me. So that's just some terminological challenges that face us. And who are these populations? I know that lots of people in the call will know who I'm talking about, but on the one hand, you have large, well-known populations all over the world, from Rohingya in Asia, those identified as Haitian and Dominican Republic, Roma across Europe. But you also have, as has been alluded to, people we know in almost every country on earth, likely in fact every country on earth, who find themselves without any citizenship for a number of reasons, including associated with migration and the documentary problems throughout the migration cycle. So that's who I'm referring to. And Pia actually asked us to examine the intent of the GCM. And that's what I'm going to start with my first question. My first challenge is, are migration policies really about migration at all? Because when you consider the impact of migration policies on people who don't have any citizenship, irrespective of whether they have ever left home, it becomes clear that migration policies are not really affecting people insofar as they move. They're affecting people insofar as they are not members of a particular community or are not recognized or given a status by a particular state. And you can see that because people who have citizenship of nowhere, irrespective of whether they've moved, are, because of migration policies, often blocked from irregular work, blocked from access to bank accounts, to education, to justice, healthcare, all the things that we know undocumented migrants are affected by, because these are people without documentation often, or with documentation that doesn't give them access to these things. And they also don't have access to regular migration routes. And Gopal mentioned detention. Well, one thing that's mentioned by people without citizenship anywhere again and again is the risk of detention, which is often indefinite, because when people don't have citizenship of anywhere, there's nowhere to which they can be deported. So any kind of detention is going to be arbitrary, and it may well be indefinite if not repeated regularly. So the first challenge I put to us is whether we're actually talking about migration at all, or whether these policies are using the logic of migration management to drive something else that's about exclusion and status. That's my first challenge. My second challenge is that we are faced with is the idea that everyone needs access to an appropriate citizenship, but that's not enough, and that legal identity and documentation is also not enough. So there's sometimes a risk of missing underlying problems. So people have already mentioned a lot of the details. I'm going to leave the detail out and just talk about the issues that I think arise as a result. So, for example, the GCM asks to make sure recognition of legal identity for everyone. However, people who are working, I can see people are working in countries where there are significant populations who have a legal identity that explicitly precludes them from access to citizenship, whether that's the non-citizen Badoon in Kuwait or the non-citizens of Estonia. These are legal identities for which people hold documents, but these legal identities preclude people from citizenship and enforce a lack of rights. So one challenge is to think about the risk of legal identity, but not only that, because we also know that citizenship in and of itself is insufficient. So if we look at what the UAE did recently when they purchased Comoros citizenship to try to end statelessness in the country, what they created was a Comorian minority in the UAE. They didn't remove the problems associated with statelessness for those people. So we need to wonder whether by focusing on the very important issues of documentation, of legal identity, and of access to citizenship, it's also important to make sure that that comes with addressing discrimination and the reasons why people are being blocked from documents and from citizenship in the first place. I could say more, but I'm trying to keep it brief to mention my 4 challenges. My third challenge has been said again and again. I'll say it yet again. The idea that basic rights need to be available without citizenship. And it's not enough just to review and revise the requirements. And that's for 2 main reasons. So on the one hand, several people have mentioned the inconsistency, the idea that we have rights that are justified on the basis of universality and that everyone should have access to them, and then to make it impossible for some people to get to access them. This just seems inconsistent. You could call them citizen rights if you want, but if we're going to say there are human rights, and I think we need to, then humans need to have access to them irrespective of status. But also, making these rights dependent on citizenship undermines the nature of citizenship. Because as we've heard, there's people who, for various reasons, don't use their documentation, or indeed might reject citizenship for all kinds of reasons, including political ones. And if very basic human rights are tied onto citizenship, then there's a risk that citizenship itself also begins to lose its meaning and becomes just an organizational category, which a lot of the logic around exclusion from citizenship precludes. So that's my third thought. And my fourth thought is that a lot of we've been talking a lot about people who move, and it's quite easy to imagine how migration policies might affect people who move. But what I suggest is that a lot of the impacts of migration policies on those without citizenship who may not move are hidden for those who aren't affected. And so the only way to address this issue is the inclusion of those who are affected, who don't have access to any citizenship. They need to be part of designing migration policies to make sure that they don't inadvertently or even advertently affect people who have no citizenship at all. That's my 4 thoughts.
Wow. Very, very deep 4 thoughts, Tendayi. No, thanks a lot for this. And I think, what is really striking is how you put it. Migration policies is not about migration at all. And when you phrase it like this, I think it really gets us thinking and digging. And I already think I know how your answer will be to this one, because in one way or another you've said it. But let me ask you this. Do you think that as we are putting kind of these documentation requirements and building these complicated systems and all of this, are we kind of making it harder and harder for people to move?
Well, actually, I think it's complicated. So there was an interesting study done by De Haas and Chaika recently. You can tell I'm an academic, I can't help myself. There was an interesting study done recently where they analysed migration policies over time. And they suggest actually we well, apart from the past 6 months, we're moving in a period with increasingly free movement for some, with increasingly blocked movement for others. So I would slightly challenge, Rula, what you said to suggest, I don't think it makes it harder and harder to move per se. It just makes it more and more distinct, those who are allowed to move about the world and those who aren't.
Thanks a lot. That is also important to kind of reflect, and maybe we haven't reflected on this sufficiently in this webinar, how these affect different groups of people differently. Thanks for flagging this.